Welcome back once again to How to Conduct a Successful Teleconference. Your presenter is Gene Dutz and my name is Cornelius Fichtner. This is the fourth out of the 6 modules here. We've looked at hard tools, time management and content, and now we're moving into the ground rules. So, Gene, what are ground rules? What's the definition?
Cornelius, the definition of ground rules is the guidelines established by the project manager to govern positive interaction by teleconference participants.
And translated, that means?
That means the rules of the road, so to speak.
Okay.
How you're going to conduct yourself, your own personal interaction. And they can change throughout the meeting process, but normally you set them at the beginning and they become a standard.
Right, and you don't mean that they change during the meeting?
No, I don't.
It's like if you have 20 meetings, you might add or remove ground rules over time.
You might find that certain procedures work better, and you don't become aware of that until after the first meeting.
Right.
And once that you're made aware, okay, then you make the change. So that maybe the idea of having an introduction each time works for the first meeting, but after a while it's the same people, and they're saying, well, we don't necessarily need to do that now because it's the same 5 people for the next 5 or 6 meetings, so you become accustomed to their voice and everything, so you don't need to do that. You change that rule.
As always, we also have learning goals for this module. This time round, we have 4.
The learning goals are how clearly stated ground rules give attendees parameters. That is, it lets them know what's acceptable and what isn't. Also, ground rules instruct the participants in basic teleconference procedures. How to modulate your voice or to make sure that you're close to a mic or things along those lines. Another is how ground rules are not a substitute for balance. That is, the ground rules are important, but they're not so rigid that they can't be changed. And then how evenly enforced ground rules enhance a person's leadership skills. That is, that you're bringing the ground rules, you're setting them up so that everybody can participate on an equal level and feel comfortable participating in the teleconference.
I think the third learning goal that talked about balance may have had a few of the participants a bit baffled here. Give us a bit more about this balance. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, the ground rules are guidelines. They're not mandates. You must have balance to be successful. You have to be flexible. What works for your teleconferences? What works in the sense of how people participate? Maybe you happen to have individuals that, they talk over one another during the teleconference, but everybody understands that, everybody's comfortable with that. Because normally you don't want to encourage people talking over one another because you're missing what it is that the first person is trying to say. But once again, it depends on the culture. It depends on how effective you are in your teleconference. So, yes, you establish rules, but you want to be flexible enough to modify them to accommodate the individuals that are participating so that they get the best out of the teleconference.
Written agenda. How does written agenda connect to ground rules?
Well, it's important because everybody understands that when I get involved in this teleconference, there's going to be some type of document that I can follow.
A rundown.
A rundown of what the agenda can be. Now, if it's a daily teleconference, normally bullet points are more than sufficient in an email. You don't need to be that grandiose. Just might be 1 or 2 items, and you'll have that, and so that you make sure everybody covers those particular items, and it gives the people who should participate an idea of what it is that will be covered. You could have a Word document, but that might be overkill, and that's why I put that as optional. The next would be for a weekly teleconference. That, once again, the bullet pointed email, and I did put down as a Word document optional, but it really depends on your audience the culture. In some situations, it should probably be a Word document rather than an email. And especially if you're going to be posting somewhere on the portal, and make sure everybody has access to it, it usually works out a little bit better. However, on a monthly teleconference, that really should be a Word document. I've indicated a bullet point email, and it's optional. I don't think it's the best form. I really think some type of a Word document listing what's going to be covered, and if there's certain expectations from certain individuals, that also be part of the document. There's also a verbal agenda. That might be something that you think, well, wait a minute, I don't understand. A verbal agenda, a written agenda? Well, it has its place. And if you're having daily teleconferencing, a lot of what is covered in that teleconference will be carried over to the following day. And you can just indicate in the teleconference that this is what we'll be talking about. And there's such a limited amount of time between the teleconferences that it can carry forward. It can be something that is doable with a daily teleconference. And one of the other things that you need to be careful about, of course, are new attendees. Suddenly people come in that haven't been involved in the daily teleconference. You want to make sure they're up to speed. That might be a situation where you actually talk with the person ahead of time, or you might send them some minutes or some information to bring them up to speed quickly. Or at the beginning of the meeting, you outline what has been covered and then what your expectations are of that individual. In an ad hoc teleconference, there's, like I said before, a single item that's going to be looked at. So many times that's verbal, or in fact most times it is verbal. You might catch somebody, call them on the phone, say, we need to get together right now. I'm going to WebEx you. Let's bring in Harry and Linda and Sally. I'll make all the arrangements. We're going to start in an hour. So it's something that requires immediate attention. And let me go back for a moment on the daily teleconferencing when I mentioned there's a closing reminder. It lets everybody know what's going to be covered the next day. When I was at one manufacturer, we were actually having daily teleconferences, and we would, at the end, the PM would say, and tomorrow we'll be looking at how the time is being managed well and by whom. Well, certain individuals didn't really need to attend, so they knew that's what's going to be covered, so they didn't bother to attend the meeting. So once again, the PM's demonstrating, I'm concerned about your time, your participation. It's really not something you need to be here for, so that individual knows that they don't need to attend. And it tells participants that this PM really knows what they're doing when it comes to managing the time, the agenda. Be sure to solicit agenda items. You can do this via email when the agenda is published. You'll ask for input. Also, what you'll do is you'll include the dates and time of the next meeting. Verbally, at the end of the teleconference, you once again mention when we're going to be meeting again and the location if it's going to be different. And then third, in the minutes, you go over the same material, you ask for input, and you provide the times for the next meeting and the location. I realize this seems to be very repeating itself with 1, 2, 3, but the more you do that, the more it becomes just a way of thinking as far as the participants are concerned, and they'll just respond automatically. You wouldn't even have to tell them that you want their input, and there'll be always an expectation of date and time. Clearly stating the meeting start and stop times is very important, as mentioned in the previous item on agenda. You want to publish this start and stop times, and you want to do it in your emails, your meeting minutes, any inter-company publications. As far as calendaring, you want to make sure that it's clearly stated, the start and stop times. And then you remind the participants of the stop time when the meeting starts. This is something that really is important because it gives everybody a mindset of, okay, we know it's going to end at such and such a time. I've got certain things I want to cover, so everybody works to the time. And you can also remind them halfway through the meeting that once again we will be stopping on the hour or on the half hour. And then, of course, at the end of the meeting, you say, thank you very much for your participation, and I'll put together the minutes and email them. The teleconference is now concluded. What are some of the rules of conduct? Well, identify yourself. This is very important. Everyone within the teleconference should identify themselves, unless it's some large conference that maybe 20, 30, 40 people.
By identify yourself, you mean when you start speaking, you say, "This is Cornelius, I have a question."
Correct.
Okay.
It's very helpful.
Yeah, because oftentimes if you're doing a phone conference, people don't see you.
They don't see you, and they aren't attuned to your voice yet. And now if it's the same teleconference on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, then they become attuned to it, and that's not as necessary. Also, make sure the mute button works. There's nothing as embarrassing as carrying on a conversation with someone else with the mute button off. This happened a few years back. An individual, high-ranking in the corporation, was on a teleconference with his boss, and he thought the mute button was on.
Sounds like a politician who thinks that the microphone's off.
Yes, and he did the exact same thing.
Oh, gosh.
And the people were clamoring to get to him to tell him to hit the mute because he was live, and he went on for minutes.
Ouch.
But at any rate, to avoid that, make sure your mute button works. And then always conduct yourself as though everyone is in the same room. That is really important. It gives the respect to the individuals that are participating. And it makes you more focused when you think, okay, granted they're all around the world, but I'll just visualize them around the table. And it makes you a more focused participant. And then another rule of conduct is to praise with a ladle and admonish with an eyedropper. And what I mean by that is that you get a lot more participation and cooperation with praise than you do by criticizing someone, unless you're really skilled in doing that, and most people aren't. Especially in a public environment. So if you're going to admonish, really try to do that offline.
Gene, what are your rules when it comes to non-agenda items, and why do we see an elephant here?
Well, that's acknowledgement that when there's an elephant in the room. And in this case, if suddenly a team member is no longer a team member, you need to address that at the beginning of the meeting. Don't think that everyone else isn't aware of it, because they are. You want to make sure that if that individual is no longer there, they've left, why they've left, but cover it. Don't think that it's going to go away. It isn't, and it's going to occupy people's minds, and then they're not going to be focused. And that's what you want to do, is you want to have everybody focused on the agenda, on what you're trying to cover in the teleconference. So by all means, address that elephant in the room.
Right, and it could be anything, right? Doesn't necessarily have to be a team member. It could be the fact that they're going into a budget round, and we've heard rumors that our project budget is going to be cut in half.
That's correct. And
Yeah,
that's
something like
a
that.
major one. That or you're going to get 25% off the budget, but the deliverables are going to remain the same.
Wonderful. Always a good thing to happen.
That's always a nice one.
So these are the non-agenda items that you don't really want to put on the agenda, but you have to discuss them.
They came up. All of a sudden it happened, and it's something that, gee whiz, we need to address it. Then there's also a take-off line. what you want to do, there's certain things that might be coming up. People might want to address something. It's important, but it really isn't important to this meeting. So you want to convey accommodation that is, Ed, that's a great question, but I think it really involves just yourself and I. Why don't we discuss this offline? Or another is that, well, we'll take that up, but it's going to have to be in a future meeting because we have a lot to cover here, and I don't want you to think it's not important, but these agenda items are why everybody is participating.
Right, and that also brings us to the next point here. It reinforces the fact that we have an agenda which we follow, and that is one of our rules of conduct.
Correct. You want to follow the agenda, and I realize that it's not the easiest thing in the world to do. It takes practice, but the reward is significant. And then you want a kind of a non-agenda item is a follow-up. It doesn't necessarily seem like it would be an agenda item, but what I'm trying to get across here is that if certain things have come up, like you want to talk with Ed afterwards, you make sure you follow up with anything that you said you were going to do. What that demonstrates to everyone is that you as a PM are a person of your word. It builds credibility, and as a project manager you want to build credibility. That is the main thing that you have in managing a project. The people, well, if Sue says she's going to do it, she'll do it. It'll get done. We'll get the resources we need. So be sure to follow up on anything that might come out of the teleconference that wasn't necessarily planned.
Okay, so we have this humongously long list of ground rules under which we hold our teleconferences here. How often should we remind ourselves of these ground rules and make sure that everybody understands, hey, this is how we manage our teleconferences together?
Well, it really depends on the frequency. If it's a daily teleconference, then you can remind the participants that on the first meeting at the beginning, and maybe a couple of meetings through that daily process, or daily meeting process, of what the ground rules are. But after a while, it's really pointless to reiterate them, unless you detect something that's
deviation, maybe
deviation. Then it's the time to bring them up again. But other than that, you really want to get to the agenda so that you kind of move forward. Now, on a weekly, monthly, or an ad hoc teleconference, let's look at the weekly and the monthly. That is something, once again, it depends on your audience and how long you've been working together, really the culture. Maybe the beginning of every meeting, just go over some brief ground rules. And by brief, I think you're only taking a minute or two here. You don't want to spend a lot of time on that. But it can be very helpful, especially if you have new participants, especially if some people you've been working together as a group for 5 or 6 weeks, and now you have a new person that's come in. Take the opportunity to let that individual know basically how you conduct the meeting and what your expectations are.
Yeah, and I don't think it's necessarily just that individual that you want to remind of these ground rules. It's everybody that gets the benefit of, oh yeah, we have ground rules. And this is a new person who's coming in, so that kind of gives you a moment in time where you say, there you go, milestone, new person, we remind ourselves of the ground rules.
It's an opportunity, and you take advantage of that. And it just kind of dovetails nicely. Nobody really thinks that much of it, but they'll remember. And it really helps the process flow. And after all, that's what you want to do in the teleconference.
Gene, before we get into this slide here where we rotate the facilitator duties, I'd like to address an elephant that may be in the room, like we've heard earlier on. And that's the fact that many people who are participating here, they might be thinking, hey, wait a minute, much of what I've heard so far is just good conference management. Now, what do you say to them? So why are we doing this here? Is it really just good common sense for managing conferences? Or is there something else here for teleconferences?
Bingo.
Bingo, okay.
You're right. That's what it is.
Actually, this is roulette here. It's not bingo.
That's
image
true.
there. Okay.
But the idea is, yes, that's what it's just common sense on how to conduct an effective meeting.
Right.
But what I've noticed is that a lot of times that does not migrate to the teleconference. That those skills that you should be aware of and hopefully are practicing in a meeting,
In person, yes.
in person, when everybody's sitting around the table, aren't necessarily the same ones that are in the teleconference.
Right.
And I think that those in a meeting, in a setting, are extremely effective. And if they're effective in a small meeting, one-on-one with everybody in the same location, then they are just as effective teleconferencing.
But they get more difficult, right?
They get more difficult. You might have to make changes. You have to learn to speak with your voice. You don't have the opportunity to look into people's eyes.
Body language, yeah.
The body language, which is extremely important. And even with video conferencing, it's to some extent it's better. It truly is. But if you learn these skills, learn how to convey concern, convey urgency, all of that in your voice, and the idea of active listening and responding, reflecting, as we'll get into a little bit later on, doing that in a teleconference situation, you'll find that the teleconference will even be more effective. And that's your goal, is to achieve certain objectives in a stated period of time, making sure that everybody can participate, does participate.
Okay, wonderful. Moving on. So the elephant is addressed. Yes, it is good meeting management, but teleconferencing takes it, you have to take it just that much further in order to be effective.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Rotate facilitator duties is actually what we're supposed to be talking about here. What is it all about?
Well, really, it's just an opportunity to give someone else within the group the chance to conduct the group. Sometimes as a PM, you might not be able to make the teleconference, but it has to go forward. Well, if you've given others the opportunity to conduct the teleconference, you have to be absent. They can go forward. They know what needs to be done. And rather than canceling it, because maybe there's something that needs to be covered, there's some information that needs to be addressed, some decisions that need to be made. So if you practice that by periodically letting somebody chair the meeting, which is much easier to do on a daily meeting basis, because there's so many of them.
Many opportunities, yes.
Many opportunities, and you give everyone on the team a chance to conduct and feel what it's like and what needs to be achieved. So you do that, periodically, and what happens, of course, is then when an emergency situation comes up, you can tap Janet or Phil.
Because they've done it before.
They've done it before.
Right.
They're familiar. And that would be the same on a weekly meeting. It's a little more tricky in some respects, since you're not together as frequently, but it's not that major a stretch to let someone substitute for you and go through the whole process and come out with the decisions and who's going to be responsible for what.
Yeah, I see the same sub-bullets here. Let someone else do it periodically. It's both for planned and emergency situations. I can see that both happening here in the daily and the weekly meetings. But what about monthly and ad hoc meetings?
Monthly and ad hoc meetings, that's not the thing to do. A monthly meeting, unless you're, maybe on death's bed or something, you're the one that's called the meeting. You're the one that everyone is expecting to conduct the meeting.
I see.
You better be the one that does it.
And of course, same in an ad hoc meeting. If you're the one calling it, you're not going to say, well, I called this meeting, but Joe over here is going to lead it.
That's correct. Yes.
Right.
An ad hoc, almost by definition, if you're calling it, you're conducting it. You don't call a meeting for someone else to conduct. So in neither situation would I rotate those duties.
All right, so this slide here is titled Venue. We see chairs here in the image, so that's the location where we hold our meeting around the world, where the teleconference happens in the various locations that come together. How does the meeting room, the cubicle, the place where I'm at, how does that help with ground rules?
Well, it helps in the sense that you want to have say a quiet area, an area where the participants can focus on the teleconference. In many situations, a cubicle, a small conference room, those are the areas that you'd like to be in. Say there are 20 of you that are participating in the teleconference, and you're all around the world. So ideally, if you could be in a small room, that would be great, or in your cubicle with your headset on to go through and participate in the teleconference. So what I'm trying to get across is that the location is important for you as far as your participation, and that is one of the ground rules, after all, is to participate,
yes,
and
be able to focus on it,
to be able to focus and feel comfortable. So if you're in your own cubicle, if you with your headset on and you're not here, there aren't distractions around you, or in a small conference room, you tend to participate more. You're engaged,
so
and
it's
that's
more
what
of
we
an
want.
indirect way of enforcing the ground rules
Yes.
by making sure that people are using the right venue, the right environment, which brings us to the second bullet point here: avoid large conference rooms.
That's my personal preference.
Yes.
Is to avoid large conference rooms, because usually they're not equipped with individual mics. I mean, if they are, then that's great. But generally they aren't. They might have one or two star mics, and you've got a lot of people. And
side conversations going and people tuning out. And
it's hard. The person on the other side saying, would you repeat yourself? Please turn up the volume. So that's something that really I think is something to avoid. The next would be, I've indicated, eliminate unnecessary foot traffic and ad hoc meetings in your work area. And what I mean by that is, if you're in your cubicle with your headset on in front of your teleconference participating, normally people that come by see that you're engaged, and they're not going to be walking around as much. They're not going to hold these impromptu ad hoc meetings as much as if you're just standing there or sitting there without a headset on. Suddenly there's a meeting of 4 people adjacent to your cubicle. You're not one of the participants, but you become one of the participants.
Yeah, because you can hear them.
You can hear them. It's very distracting. But when you've got the headset on and you're focused, most people are very aware of that and do their best to avoid disturbing you. Another thing, as far as on the venue, is you let your coworkers know that you're joining a teleconference. Normally they can see that when they walk by, but there might be some folks that are wondering, gee, why isn't Gene in this meeting? And someone can say, well, he's in a teleconference. So that's
right.
That's just some courtesy.
Right. So venue, maybe not necessarily a direct participant or a direct input into the ground rules, but it's definitely an indirect way of ensuring that the ground rules can actually take place.
Correct. Yes.
We're coming to the benefits page. That means we're getting close to the end of the ground rules module. Gene, please remind us, how do the ground rules help us? What are their benefits in regards to teleconferencing?
Well, one of the major benefits is that they provide clarity. Everyone understands what's expected from them. They also delineate acceptable behavior from unacceptable behavior. And they build teamwork. And by that I mean it really does foster participation, and it does increase camaraderie. And those are important elements in people participating as a team in a teleconference. And then finally, the demands on leadership. What it does is it makes sure that the PM follows through. That is, the PM understands that, okay, I need to make sure that Harry and Fred understand that this particular behavior is not acceptable. You followed through, let them know. And that information gets around. Everybody understands then. If you don't follow the ground rules, then someone will be talking with you about that. And it's not to be, whip and chain kind of thing. What it is I just want everybody to have the opportunity to participate. That's why I'm putting down the ground rules. I want people to feel comfortable. I want their input, because to be an effective project manager, you need everybody's input so decisions can be made. And without that, it makes it very difficult to achieve your goals.
And what are your tips when it comes to ground rules?
Well, Cornelius, there's really only one tip, and that is to mentally reconsider whether or not the ground rules should be revisited at the beginning of each meeting. You might find out that they need to be or they don't need to be. But what this technique does, it helps you place yourself in the right mindset prior to the meeting. You will make a judgment. And if this is, like I said, a daily meeting, it might not be necessary to do that. Or maybe every fourth or fifth meeting, or whenever someone new comes in. But as the project manager, you need to make the decision as to whether or not this particular subject...
It is necessary now.
If it's necessary now. If it isn't, then go on without it.
Yeah, and it also makes sure that you at least adhere to the ground rules.
And that's another one. That's another one. Very important one is that you adhere to those ground rules. Now it's time to take action. So prior to your next teleconference, complete the Rules of Conduct worksheet with the appropriate check marks. Then once you've done that, you begin your next meeting by reciting the Rules of Conduct. After the teleconference is over, you complete the worksheet to find out what you did do, what you didn't do, and what was followed through on. You can note improvement. There will be some improvement. However, there will also be some areas that you need to work on. And that's the great thing about this, because then you get to repeat it for the next teleconference. You are having an opportunity to practice every time. And believe me, you will get better the more you practice, to the point where you won't need the worksheet, maybe for a periodic tune-up every 6 or 7 months or something like that. But by all means, take a look at the worksheet and implement it in your next teleconference.